The CEO said, "Why won't you look at me?" And the moment those words left her lips, I knew I'd either found my salvation or my damnation. Her name was Emily Brooks, the woman who just bought the property next to mine. Bold red shirt, eyes that held secrets, hands that signed contracts worth millions but didn't know the first thing about fixing fence posts. She stood on my construction site holding blueprints, asking questions that could wake the dead or bury me deeper with them. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you are tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories travel. I'd been dead for 5 years, though my body hadn't figured out yet. I work construction now, stacking lumber and pouring concrete for a woman who owned half the county. Emily Brooks was the CEO of a massive development firm, and she'd been watching me for weeks before she finally approached me on the job site that Tuesday afternoon. The sun was brutal that day, the kind of heat that made everything shimmer and turned the construction site into a furnace. I'd been carrying loads of 2x4s from the delivery truck to the frame area for 3 hours straight. My back ached. My hands were raw despite the gloves, and sweat had soaked through my shirt. But I preferred the physical pain. It gave me something to focus on other than the emptiness inside. I saw her Mercedes pull up at the site entrance around 2 in the afternoon. The other workers noticed too. They always did when Emily Brooks showed up. She was the kind of woman who commanded attention without trying, but I kept my head down and kept working. I'd gotten good at not being seen over the years. She walked across the site in heels that had no business being on a construction zone. She wore that red shirt that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, and she carried blueprints under her arm. I watched her from the corner of my eye as she talked to the foreman, pointed at various parts of the structure, checked measurements. She was thorough. She knew her business. Then she turned and looked directly at me. Not at the workers around me, not at the structure behind me, but at me specifically. She started walking in my direction, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 5 years, a spike of genuine emotion. It was panic mixed with curiosity, and I hated both. She walked right up to me while I was carrying another load and asked why I wouldn't look at her. The question stopped me cold. I stood there with lumber in my arms, sweat dripping down my face, trying to figure out what she meant. I looked at people all the time. I looked at my co-workers, at my daughter, at the cashier at the grocery store. But that wasn't what she meant, and I knew it. She meant really looking, seeing, connecting. I'd spent half a decade avoiding that kind of looking because it required being present, being alive, being willing to feel something. My wife, Sarah, had died giving birth to our daughter, Rose, and I decided that day that I was done with feelings. I told Emily I didn't know what she was talking about. I said I had work to do and tried to walk past her, but she didn't move. She stood there and told me she'd been watching me. She said she'd noticed how I moved through the world like a ghost, how I never made eye contact, how I worked harder than anyone else but seemed to take no pride in it. She said she needed to know if I was still human or if I'd died along with my wife. That last part hit me hard. How did she know about Sarah? I'd never talked about my wife at work. I kept my personal life completely separate. Emily explained that she'd asked around about me. She'd heard I used to be an architect before switching to construction. She'd heard about my wife's death, about how I was raising my daughter alone, about how I'd become a hermit. She'd heard all of it, and instead of leaving me alone like everyone else, she decided to confront me. I asked her what business it was of hers, how I lived my life. She said it became her business when she bought the property next to mine 6 months ago. She said she'd been watching me through the fence line, seeing me go through the motions without actually being alive. She said she needed to know if I was capable of being a good neighbor or if I was going to spend the rest of my life being a dead man. I left work early that day. I couldn't handle her questions. Couldn't handle the way she looked at me like she could see through all the walls I'd built. I drove straight to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. I visited every week, always on Thursday afternoons, always alone. I would stand at Sarah's grave and talk to her like she could hear me. I'd apologize for still being alive, for not being able to save her, for failing at the one thing that mattered. That day, I told Sarah about Emily. I told her about the question, about how it had rattled me. I asked Sarah what she wanted me to do. I asked if I was supposed to stay frozen forever. I asked for permission to stop hurting, even though I knew she couldn't answer. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Emily had followed me from the construction site. She found me standing at Sarah's headstone, and instead of apologizing or leaving, she sat down on the grass and waited. She waited while I finished talking to a dead woman. She waited until I was done begging for permission to stop hurting. Then she stood up and told me her own story. Emily had been married to Richard Parker. She said his name like it tasted bad. Richard had been her college sweetheart, the man everyone thought was perfect, but in private, he was something else entirely. She told me Richard had treated her like property from the day they got married. He controlled her money, her schedule, her friends, her career. When she wanted to start her own business, he laughed and told her she didn't have the intelligence for it. When she did it anyway, he took credit for her success. Emily said she spent 10 years being owned by Richard Parker. 10 years of being told she was nothing without him. He monitored her phone calls, read her emails, showed up unannounced at her office. He called it love. She called it prison. When she finally decided to leave him, Richard didn't accept it. He fought the divorce with every legal weapon he had. The divorce had been dragging on for 2 years. She'd moved to our town to escape him, but Richard had found her anyway. Emily asked me if I understood what she was saying. We were both haunted. My ghost was buried 6 feet under. Her ghost was still breathing and trying to drag her back. She asked me which was worse, mourning someone who'd loved you or running from someone who claimed to love you but really just wanted to own you. She asked me if I was capable of living again or if I'd already given up. She said she needed to know because she was my neighbor now, and she didn't want to watch another person waste their life. That night, I went home and really looked at my daughter for the first time in years. Rose was 5 years old, with Sarah's green eyes and my dark hair. She was watching cartoons when I walked in. I sat down next to her and asked if she was happy. She looked at me and asked why I always seemed sad. That question gutted me. My 5-year-old daughter had noticed what I'd been trying to hide. She'd seen through my attempts to be functional. I asked Rose what made her think I was sad. She said I never smiled anymore. Not really. She said she wished I could be happy like the dads on TV. I realized what Emily had been trying to tell me. I'd been so busy mourning the dead that I'd forgotten about the living. Rose deserved better than a father who was just going through the motions. Sarah had died so Rose could live, and I'd been dishonoring that sacrifice by refusing to actually be alive myself. Emily moved on to the neighboring ranch the following month, and everything changed. I couldn't avoid her anymore. Our property shared a fence line that ran for almost a quarter mile. She'd wave at me in the mornings when she was having coffee on her porch. She'd call out greetings when she saw me working. I'd give short answers and find excuses to go back inside, but she didn't give up. Emily started asking me to help with things on her property. She'd call and say her water pump was making a strange noise. Could I take a look? Or her fence had a loose post. Could I help fix it? I knew what she was doing. Emily Brooks ran a multi-million-dollar development company. She didn't need me to fix her water pump, but I went anyway. The water pump worked fine. The fence post wasn't loose. Emily would smile and say she must have imagined problems, then offer me coffee. We'd talk about nothing important. The weather, the county, local news. She never pushed me to talk about Sarah or my feelings. She just let me exist in her space without demanding anything. Rose noticed Emily immediately. My daughter started asking when she could visit. The pretty lady in the red shirt. She'd see Emily outside and wave with both hands. Emily would wave back and blow kisses, and Rose would giggle. One Saturday morning, Rose ran over to Emily's property before I could stop her. I found her sitting on Emily's porch, eating cookies and telling Emily about her imaginary friend who lived in the barn. I tried to apologize and drag Rose home, But Emily told me to stop apologizing for my daughter being happy. That hit me hard. I'd been so focused on my own grief that I hadn't realized Rose had been lonely. Emily started inviting us over for dinner. At first I refused, but Rose begged. So we went. Emily cooked simple food and asked Rose about school and told stories about growing up on a farm in Nebraska. She didn't ask me invasive questions. She just let me exist. But then one night, after Rose had fallen asleep on Emily's couch, Emily asked me when I was going to stop punishing myself. She said I'd been wearing my grief like armor, using it to keep everyone away. She said Sarah wouldn't have wanted this for me or for Rose. I got angry. I told Emily she didn't know anything about Sarah or what she would have wanted. I carried Rose home and didn't speak to Emily for a week. But she was right. I'd been using Sarah's death as an excuse to stop living, because living hurt too much. I convinced myself that if I stopped grieving, I'd be betraying Sarah's memory. Somewhere along the way, I decided that moving forward meant forgetting her. Emily kept trying. She'd leave meals on my porch with notes for Rose. She'd ask me to help with projects, pay me more than the work was worth. She'd sit on her side of the fence in the evenings and just exist nearby, not pushing, just being there in case I was ready. I started looking at her, really looking at her, not through her or past her, but at her. I noticed the way she'd bite her lip when she was thinking, the way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when nervous. And I realized I was feeling something I thought was dead, hope. We fell into a routine. Every Saturday, Rose would go to Emily's house, and they'd bake together. Sometimes I'd join them, sitting at the kitchen table while they measured flour and argued about chocolate chips. Emily told stories about her childhood, about learning to drive a tractor at age 10, about county fairs. Rose listened with rapt attention, living vicariously through Emily's memories. Emily asked Rose about school, about her favorite subjects, about the books she liked. She asked about Rose's imaginary friend and took it seriously, never mocking. She asked Rose what she wanted to be when she grew up, and when Rose said she didn't know, Emily said that was fine. I watched these interactions and felt something shifting inside me. Emily wasn't just being nice to Rose. She genuinely enjoyed my daughter's company. She treated Rose like a real person. She gave Rose attention and interest and kindness, all the things I should have been giving her, but had been too broken to provide. I apologized to Emily eventually. I showed up with flowers from my garden and said I'd try to be less of an ass. Emily laughed and said she'd been called worse for speaking uncomfortable truths. Things went back to normal. Better than normal. Actually, I started talking more, sharing more, letting my walls down bit by bit. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My dad said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. Richard Parker showed up on a Thursday afternoon, 3 months after Emily had moved in. I was fixing a fence when I saw a black Mercedes pull up to Emily's house. A man got out wearing an expensive suit, and everything about him screamed money and power and entitlement. I watched him knock on Emily's door. I watched her answer and immediately try to close it. I watched him force his way inside. Something in my gut told me this wasn't going to end well. I dropped my tools and started walking toward Emily's house. By the time I got there, I could hear raised voices. Richard was shouting about property rights and legal documents. Emily was telling him to leave, that the divorce was finalized. Richard laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. I walked right in and found Richard standing too close to Emily, backing her toward the wall. He had dead eyes, the kind that looked at people and saw objects. When he saw me, he smiled. Richard asked who I was. I told him I was Emily's neighbor and she wanted him to leave. He said this was a private matter between husband and wife. I said they weren't married anymore. He said the law disagreed, that he had papers proving the divorce wasn't finalized. Emily told him he was lying. She said the divorce had been finalized 2 weeks ago. Richard said those documents were fraudulent, that he'd filed an injunction based on her hiding assets. Richard pulled out a gun from his jacket. Not a small handgun, but a custom piece with leather grips and chrome detailing. He didn't point it at anyone yet. He just held it at his side, like a reminder that he was serious. He said he wasn't leaving without Emily. He said she could come willingly, or he could have her declared mentally incompetent. He said either way, she was coming back where she belonged. Emily told him she'd rather die than go back. Richard said that could be arranged. That's when I stepped between them. I told Richard he needed to leave. Richard pointed the gun at me and asked if I was sleeping with his wife. I realized what Emily had been running from. Richard Parker genuinely believed he owned another human being. He talked about Emily like she was property, an investment he'd made. Emily told Richard she wasn't going anywhere. She said she spent 10 years being owned by him, and she was done. Richard said he'd take everything, the company, the money, the ranch, and make sure she never worked again. I asked Richard what he wanted. He said he wanted Emily to sign papers giving him half of everything. Emily said she didn't believe him, that he'd never let her go. Richard said she was right. I realized I had to make a choice. I could step aside or I could fight. I'd been dead for 5 years, but I didn't want to be dead anymore. I wanted to see Rose grow up. I wanted more Saturday morning baking sessions. I wanted to live. So I grabbed Richard's wrist, tried to force him to drop the gun. We struggled, crashing into furniture. The gun went off. The sound was deafening. The bullet went into the ceiling, missing everyone. Richard broke free and pointed the gun at Emily. He told her she had 1 week to sign the papers, or he'd come back and kill us both. Then he left. Emily collapsed onto the floor. She said Richard would never stop. I sat down next to her and told her about Sarah. Really told her. I talked about how we'd met in college, about our first date, about the years we'd spent planning our future. I told her about finding out Sarah was pregnant, about the day Rose was born. I told her the doctor had given me a choice between saving Sarah or saving the baby. But Sarah had already decided. She'd told the doctors weeks before to save the baby if anything went wrong. She'd chosen Rose over herself. I told Emily I'd been angry at Sarah for dying, furious at her for leaving me alone, angry at myself for being angry. I'd been trapped in that anger for 5 years, using it to keep everyone away. Emily asked me if I was still angry. I realized I wasn't. Somewhere between meeting Emily and fighting Richard, I'd let go of the anger. I'd forgiven Sarah. I'd forgiven myself. I'd given myself permission to want something more. I told Emily I wasn't going to let Richard take her. I said I'd been waiting for permission from a ghost to start living, but I was done waiting. Emily asked if I was ready to actually live or just talking about it. So I kissed her. It was the first time I'd kissed anyone since Sarah, and it felt like betrayal and salvation all at once. Richard came back 3 days later with his lawyers and documents. But this time I was ready. I'd talked to Sheriff Marcus and filed a report. I'd contacted Emily's divorce lawyer. I'd installed security cameras. And I'd made sure Rose was staying with Mrs. Henderson. When Richard knocked, I answered. He wasn't expecting that. He demanded to speak with his wife. I told him Emily wasn't his wife anymore. Richard showed me papers claiming the divorce wasn't valid. I told him to leave. Sheriff Marcus pulled up. I'd called him before Richard arrived. Marcus asked Richard what he was doing there. Richard said he was trying to talk to his wife. Marcus asked if Richard had a restraining order against him. Richard's smile disappeared. Marcus said Emily had renewed her restraining order last week. Richard was violating it by being there. Richard's lawyers tried to intervene, but Marcus said they could mail papers instead of showing up with their threatening client. Richard pulled out the gun again, pointing at Marcus. Marcus drew his own weapon and ordered Richard to drop it. The situation went deadly in seconds. Emily came out and told Richard to put the gun down. Richard said she was still his. The company was still his. Everything was his. I stepped between the gun and Emily again. Richard asked if I had a death wish. I said no. I had a life wish. I wanted to keep living, help raise my daughter, figure out what Emily and I could be together. Richard's hand shook. I could see him calculating. Marcus was shouting. Emily was begging. I was standing there waiting to see if this was how my story ended. Richard lowered the gun, not from conscience, but because the math didn't work. Too many witnesses, too many cameras. He threw the gun down and said Emily would regret this. Marcus arrested Richard for armed assault and terroristic threats. After they left, Emily collapsed onto the porch laughing, this slightly hysterical sound from pure relief. She'd been fighting Richard for 2 years, and now he was finally in handcuffs. I told Emily I wasn't married anymore. She looked confused. I explained I'd been married to Sarah's ghost for 5 years, but I was done with that. I'd finally let Sarah go. Emily asked what I wanted. I said I wanted to keep having Saturday baking sessions. I wanted dinners together. I wanted to figure out if this thing between us could be real. She asked if I was sure. She said I came with baggage, a dead wife I'd always loved, a daughter who came first, 5 years of shutdown. I said she came with baggage too, an abusive ex, a demanding company, trauma to process. We were both damaged. Maybe that's why we'd work. We didn't rush anything. We took our time over the following months. Rose kept her Saturday baking sessions. Emily taught Rose to identify wildflowers, predict storms, stand up for herself. Rose bloomed under Emily's attention. I started remembering how to be happy, how to laugh, how to enjoy a sunset without guilt, how to make plans instead of just surviving. 6 months after Richard's arrest, I asked Emily if she wanted to combine our properties. She said yes. We tore down the fence and merged them into one property with 2 houses. Rose got her own room in both places. We became a family. Richard tried to fight from prison, but the evidence was overwhelming. He eventually pleaded guilty and got 5 years. A year after his arrest, Emily and I got married. I wanted the courthouse, but Emily said she wanted to do it in the cemetery where Sarah was buried. We stood in front of Sarah's headstone with Rose between us and Sheriff Marcus officiating. I told Sarah I loved her, that I'd always love her, but that I was choosing to live now. I thanked her for Rose, for our years together, for saving our daughter. Emily understood that loving her didn't mean I'd stopped loving Sarah. She knew I could hold both in my heart. We were both broken people who'd found a way to be whole together. We built a good life. Emily kept running her company. I went back to architecture. Rose grew up with 2 parents who chose to be there, who showed her that love wasn't about ownership. It was about freedom and choice. Richard got out after 3 years and moved away. We heard he'd found another woman to control. We felt sorry for her, but couldn't help. Sometimes I still visited Sarah's grave, but now Emily and Rose came with me. We'd bring flowers and tell Sarah about our lives. It felt less like mourning and more like sharing joy. I looked at Emily now without fear or guilt. I looked at her and saw my present and future. I looked at her and chose to keep choosing her every day for the rest of my life. And that choice had changed everything. This story teaches us that grief can become a prison when we use it to avoid living, and that honoring those we've lost means embracing a life they gave us rather than dying alongside them. It shows that real love isn't about ownership or control. It's about choosing someone freely every day. The story reminds us that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting the past. It means carrying those lessons in love while making room for new joy and new beginnings. Most importantly, it demonstrates that healing isn't linear, that damaged people can build beautiful lives together, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is give yourself permission to be happy again. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My dad said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to this channel. And let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. And here's what I need to know. Do you want part 2?